In this video, we'll talk about the different components of GDP. And one important thing to remember is that we will be using the expenditure approach when we think about getting to GDP or the different components of GDP. So economists like to use the letter Y to represent GDP. Don't ask me why, but Y is GDP. And we want to understand, because we know GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time, we can think about who spends on these goods and services that are produced. So one way to do this is to answer this question, who spends on these goods and services? And you might come up with some answers like maybe it is the households that spend on goods and services. Maybe it is the firms or companies that spend on goods and services. Maybe it is the government that spends on goods and services, and maybe there are other people in the world outside of our country that spend on goods and services. Okay, so remember that we are talking about the expenditure approach to getting to a measure for GDP, getting to an equation for GDP. So we're asking this question about who spends on these goods and services. So you have households, firms, and governments that are spending on goods and services, and you have foreigners or foreign countries that are spending on goods and services. And so we can try to make sense of this by saying that sometimes households, firms, and governments can also spend on goods and services, or spend money on goods and services that aren't produced in the United States, for example. So there might be some expenditure which is on foreign produced goods and services. And you know by now what that is called. So we'll get to that in a minute. But let's try to talk about what do we mean by, what do we call the expenditure on goods and services by households? So that expenditure is called consumption. So this is consumption, represented by the letter C. Should be easy to remember. Any expenditure by firms is called investment, denoted by the letter I. And remember, this is not the investment, the financial investment that we're thinking about. We'll clarify that in the next video, but we're thinking about firms buying, let's say, a software for their employee, or firms buying a space to operate their businesses. Okay. Now there's only one little component of household spending that actually enters investment, which is the purchase of new homes. This is the only thing you want to keep in mind. And then finally you have governments that spend. So this is government purchases of goods and services. And then you have foreigners who are buying our goods and services, and so that is called exports. Those are exports. Okay, so if we add all of this up, all of the spending we're doing as households, all the spending that firms are doing, whether it's on whether households are spending on new homes, or firms are spending on softwares for their employees, or buying office spaces and things like that, and if governments are spending on national defense and healthcare, etc., all of that can be added up, and all the expenditure that people outside of the United States are doing on things that are produced here. Okay, all of those can be added up. And the final thing we want to take care of is we want to get to a measure of GDP, which is or the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. So sometimes households, firms, governments may also spend on things that aren't produced here. So we are going to correct for that, and we're going to subtract off imports. Imports are foreign produced goods and services. Okay, so you have, what we have here is an identity that holds, which is saying that GDP, which is denoted by Y, equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus X minus M, and we refer to that as net exports. So this term here is also called net exports. Exports less imports. And this identity holds in economic accounting.